I love calling this the first annual because it will encourage us to have one every year. So I'm gonna first thank you all for attending. I want to thank a few people for helping organize this. So first of all, to the Office of Inclusive Excellence, James Felton and Carrie Tillett and others, especially Carrie who helped me organize this. I appreciate it. We worked together to try to plan a very vibrant Black History Month calendar, and I hope you all will be attending the number of events that we have. I'd also like to just thank the criminology department, especially Dr. Margaret Leger and Patricia Becker, because they had a teach-in in the criminology department in the fall that really inspired me to have one for African-American studies. And Dr. Becker especially helped me think about how to conceive this. I want to introduce my three speakers. So I'm looking at all these bright, beautiful faces right now. So first I'm going to introduce Professor Michael B. Mitchell, who is this year a visiting professor jointly appointed in criminology and African-American studies, but he will be joining the faculty of the college in the fall as a tenure track professor. So yay. He's already inspiring students. We're hearing all about how great his classes are. So we feel very lucky and honored to have him among our faculty. So Professor Mitchell is a critical criminologist who critiques power, privilege, and racism in their relation to the systems of oppression, namely the criminal legal system. He received a BS in Administrative Justice from Texas Southern University, which is a historically Black college, university actually, and an MA in Criminology and Criminal Justice from the University of Texas at Arlington. And he is currently completing his PhD in Administration of Justice at TSU. His current research agenda focuses on the experiences of formerly incarcerated parents and their adjustment to family life after incarceration. As a former police and jail detention officer, Professor Mitchell incorporates his practitioner, research, and personal experiences into his pedagogy to challenge students' perceptions of crime and the administration of justice. At TCNJ, Professor Mitchell teaches social justice-oriented courses, including special topics, school to prison pipeline, advanced criminology, race and crime, and introduction to social justice. Beyond the classroom, he is the advisor of Students for Prison Education and Reform, SPEAR, at TCNJ, an organization committed to increasing awareness about and inspiring transformative change toward the injustices that plague our nation's criminal and legal system. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Alma Kashwane. Alma Kashwane, I didn't get my researches access to the street in post-colonial and settler colonial nation states as a site of understanding and articulating access to citizenship. Alma's research projects examine ephemeral visual culture production, graffiti, murals, and other forms of street and public art as a standalone material object that orient, disorient, and reorient feminist debates on social, political, cultural movements within urban geographies and of the erasure of co-optation and resistance. Alma is invested in examining how urban beautification projects and cleansing public spaces are part of authoritarian visual culture and politics of respectability that aim at policing minoritized bodies in public spaces. Alma earned a PhD in feminist studies from the University of Washington, Seattle, an MA in community art education from Rhode Island School of Design, and a BS in environmental policy and behavior from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Alma identifies as far West Asian and lives with Rocco the cat and 30+ plants. And is rocking a bad hairstyle today. I mean, you look so good. Oh, man. Sorry, all my papers. So our last speaker today is Dr. Adaranya Onyouwainwe. Dr. Ada. She said I did 0.3 on that. A second generation Nigerian of the Igbo tribe. She's a faculty member in the College of New Jersey Psychology Department and leads the identity development across the African Diaspora Lab. She received a PhD and a Master's of Education in Educational Psychology from the University of Washington and her BS in Human Development with minors in education, sociology, and psychology from the University of California, Davis. Her research interests lie at the intersections of education, psychology, and sociology. Her scholarship investigates how racial and ethnic identity, immigration, and racial discrimination influence the academic trajectories and mental health of Black American, African, Caribbean, and Afro-Latinx adolescents and young adults. She can't live without her bam, music, her besties, music, burritos from Cali, music, weightlifting, and last but not least, you guessed it, music. You gotta tell me what your favorite jam is right now, Ada. I put you on the spot?
No, not at all. Honestly, it's this new artist that I found. She used to be a classical, she was classically trained, but now has switched over to like pop and R&B. Her name is Awa, and her song, My Love.
Nice.
Yeah.
Everyone's gonna go Google it now. So the format for today's conversation will be that each of our presenters will present for about 15 minutes. They'll all go in a row, and then we'll have times for question and answer. You can use your virtual raise hand. That'd be the easiest for us to see you to ask a question, or you can put your question into the chat. Okay, so we probably have a half an hour at the end for questions. So I'm gonna let Professor Mitchell start, and I'll be kind of a timekeeper.
I do apologize. I'm answering emails. There are students, family members, and friends asking for the passcode. So I do apologize. So let me just share my screen here and then I'll get started. So again, hello everyone. My name is Professor Mitchell. This is my first year at the College of New Jersey. Currently a visiting assistant professor, but as Dr. Williams mentioned, I will be starting a tenure track this fall. I'm currently in Department of African American Studies and Criminology, and my work more recently has focused on the impact of incarceration on families. This area of research, to me, it's exciting and interesting to me, both for research purposes and academic reasons, but also personal reasons. Academically and in the research, the experiences of formerly incarcerated parents receive less attention in scholarly research than that of the children of incarcerated parents, which has been gaining more momentum in the area of parental incarceration. And therefore, I saw a pathway into this line of work that was, unexplored, that was severely, undertaken in research in criminology and criminal justice specifically, because that's my home discipline. Personally, I've had several friends that are parents and have been incarcerated. I have friends who are currently in prison, who live this life. This is a reality for them. And therefore, the challenges they go through and the strains and struggles that they endure are what sparked my interest in this area of work. So for me, it's beyond research, although there is academic motivation for this line of work. But I feel like, in a sense, I'm telling a story. I'm telling a story of those voices that are marginalized, those voices that have been forgotten. And in a sense, I feel like for both myself and those that I'm personally connected to, it's a form of therapy, because I feel like I'm living their sentence out with them, especially those that are currently incarcerated. So I feel like I'm telling their stories, and we're getting through this process, this struggle together. So the title of my talk today, can everybody still see my screen?
Yes. Okay.
So the title of my talk today is Pains of Imprisonment and Fatherhood, a qualitative exploration of formerly incarcerated Black men. So this project this is an ongoing study. So my talk today it'll cover preliminary themes. It's something I'm just starting the data analysis part of my research. I'm also even still collecting data. So I'll be just walking you through some of my thoughts and some of my preliminary themes and findings. So the pains of imprisonment in fatherhood. One thing that I like to mention when I'm doing talks with individuals that are formerly incarcerated, because I'm connected with different nonprofit organizations in my home state of Texas that serve this population. One thing that I often tell them when I introduce myself and I talk about the work that I've been engaged in, I say, all of you gentlemen, especially when I'm talking to a room of men, but I do this work with men and women. But when I'm talking to formerly incarcerated men, many of whom are fathers, I like to say, society, often when we talk about criminal justice reform, we hear criminal justice reform played out in the media, and we hear these discussions. A critique I have is that we often reduce these individuals to ex-offenders, ex-convicts, and terms that center their criminal records. But beyond this, these individuals are fathers, their brothers, their sons, for the women that I talk to, their mothers, their sisters, and so forth. They have roles, that are integral to their beings that often are not highlighted, are not amplified because of their criminal record or the worst decision in their lives. So my talk today is a snippet from my ongoing data collection of maternal and paternal reentry. And it focuses on not only the strains or struggles that formerly incarcerated fathers, especially Black fathers, encounter, but how incarceration has impacted even their identities, their paternal identities. So just a little background. It's important to look at parental incarceration more broadly, whether you're looking at focusing on the children of incarcerated parents, or whether you focusing on the parents themselves, because more than half of incarcerated individuals are parents. Excuse the typo. And this is an important fact to consider, because if more than 60% of incarcerated men and more than 60% of incarcerated women have children, then that means that incarceration not only impacts those individuals themselves, but its tentacles, pervade their communities, their family life. And as scholar Christopher Wildman and Sarah Wakefield argue in their book, this is exacerbating inequality and creating children of the prison boom. Therefore, we have millions of children in America that have experienced a parent in prison. And this has long-term effects. Nearly 744,000 fathers are in prison throughout the United States. This is not counting fathers that are also incarcerated in jails. So the substantial portion of our correctional population are fathers, are men with children. Many of them are under the age of 18. So think about how, it's important to think about how our carceral system and the carceral state is having a deleterious effect disproportionately on communities of color and children of color. In fact, in mid-year 2007, more than 4 in 10 fathers in state and federal prison were Black. A haunting number that appears even more startling when considering the fact that their children represent half of those under the age of 18 with a father in prison. So we have these broad conversations about mass incarceration, criminal justice reform, even abolition, which has been, which is coming to the forefront. It's important to realize that not only should we focus on individuals with criminal records themselves, but also that their criminal records and the collateral consequences of their imprisonment or their records affect their children as well. It affects their family life. It affects their communities. So just some previous literature. This is not exhaustive. But the paternal pains of imprisonment. In his work, The Society of Captives, Gresham Sykes, well-known sociologist who studied a maximum security prison actually here in New Jersey, he mentioned that when individuals are incarcerated, when they're locked in these carceral spaces, they experience and encounter what is called pains of imprisonment, or deprivations. For instance, deprivations of liberty, their freedom is taken away. Deprivation of autonomy. They no longer have control over themselves They no longer govern themselves. They have to do what a correctional officer tells them to do. They have to go to sleep when a correctional officer or correctional staff tells them to. A deprivation of heterosexual relationships. But what Sykes doesn't cover or cover extensively, and what Onyouwainwe extends, is during the incarceration experience, there's also a deprivation of family life. And since incarceration and reentry are gender, there's gendered experiences, gender-specific experiences for men and women that are incarcerated. But deprivation of family life, especially with regards to contact with children, has been severely underexplored in the social science, especially in criminology. So Onyouwainwe argues that one pain of imprisonment that many men encounter and deal with is the separation from their children. With regards to Black males in reentry, because racial disparities are evident in the criminal legal system. They're vast, and countless research has showed that Black males in particular are disproportionately, arrested, incarcerated, sentenced longer, and also encounter barriers once released from incarceration, whether that be county jail, state, and federal prison. However, Williams and colleagues argue that research on the daily lived experiences of formerly incarcerated Black males is limited. So while we have, substantial quantitative mixed methods research, even some interesting qualitative work that looks at the experiences of Black males reentering society from incarceration, the focus on daily lived experiences, focusing on their battles with employment and housing, is something that is not explored as much, especially through the perspective and the words of those that are affected. So their piece is qualitative in nature, and they interview formerly incarcerated Black males in Paterson, New Jersey, to ask them, to dive into, their daily struggles, navigating these various institutions after incarceration. But Williams and colleagues also highlight the strains of fatherhood as an underexplored area in reentry research. So censoring fatherhood or the experiences of formerly incarcerated Black men, censoring their experiences as father, as men with children, as men that are part of families, is severely lacking. And incarceration often alters or changes paternal identity. It affects communication with their children, and not even specifically just for Black men, but because incarceration is disproportionately concentrated in economically distressed communities where Black men often reside, or many of them reside, especially those involved in the legal system. It's important to also highlight, their experiences of being fathers and how incarceration affects their paternal roles. So my methodology, and again, this is an ongoing study exploring similarities and differences in experiences of maternal and paternal incarceration and reentry. So I'm looking at formerly incarcerated mothers and their experiences, as well as formerly incarcerated fathers. For the sake of this presentation, I'll be talking about just some of my data with formerly incarcerated Black fathers in particular. So my study is qualitative in nature. I've been conducting semi-structured interviews. The process in which I collect my data is through a recruit. For data collection purposes, is through purposive sampling. So I mainly, I intentionally recruit from organizations in Texas, my home state, that serve formerly incarcerated individuals. And to be eligible for my study, you have to be at least 18 years of age, identify as a mother or father, and have been previously incarcerated. So one of my themes, paternal pains of imprisonment. But through my preliminary analysis of my data, I recognize this feeling of helplessness. And this was substantiated by one of my participants, Rick, who said, well, my oldest child, she was molested and raped by her stepdad, and her mother went on to marry the man. They're together right now. So that really messed with me a whole lot. And my oldest child is broken behind it right now. that really broke me down in prison. You know, not being able to be there for her when that actually happened to her. It was always on my mind that if I was free, maybe that happened to her. Maybe that wouldn't have happened to her. Maybe that would have never happened. So that messes with me a whole lot. So, you know, several of my participants, I only included Rick's narrative here, but several of my participants felt like when they were incarcerated, their hands were tied behind their backs. They couldn't, you know, they couldn't be a father. They couldn't be there for their children. They couldn't be there to protect their children. And that weighed on them heavily. And that also made them question their paternal identity. You know, am I really a father if I can't be out there taking care of my kids? Maternal blame. So Rick also went on to talk about how, in a sense, he blamed the mother for allowing it to happen. He says, I questioned her mom about it, and I never got any answers from her of why she allowed this to happen, and still go on to be with the man, get married to him, have 3 more little kids by him. It wasn't just him. It was some guys on his side of the family also that mistreated my daughter in that type of way. So, you know, these fathers that and Rick is, you know, he's from the incarcerated Black father. But many of the fathers that I interviewed, there was this anger because yes, they were incarcerated. They were limited in what they could do for their children and for their families. But in instances where the children were living in unsafe environments, there was this blame placated unto the mothers. You know, like, how could you let this be happening? Although many times these were the same individuals, these are the same women that were holding them down, that were taking care of them while they were incarcerated. Fatherhood, you know, is another thing, learning how to be a father. So many of my participants, especially my Black male participants, came from households, you know, single parent households. Therefore, they didn't, you know, they felt like they didn't have a good example of what it meant to be a father. They didn't really know how to be a father. So for instance, Terrence says, so the way my father raised me, most times it was through absenteeism. He also goes on to say, so it's because I had to learn that by what I didn't get, you know, and it's the same thing with my sons. They learned to be fathers by what they didn't have. Terrence served 29 and a half years in prison. He just came home a few months ago. And I recall him telling me that, you know, his sons are doing well. His 2 sons are grown, and they're grown now. And he talked about how he's by watching them and how they father their children, you know, how they're father to their sons, he's learning from that. So he feels like it's a learning experience only, you know, watching his own sons, not only his own sons, but his brother-in-law. So it's a process. He's trying to learn something that he felt like he never had an example to follow, something that he never had. And this next narrative it really struck me when I heard this, because Terrence, there was this he mentioned how in the community where he grew up, there were few examples of what it meant to be a father. And his conception of what it meant to be a man and a father was being sexually active, was being aggressive, was, you know, running the streets. And therefore, before he was incarcerated, he said, although he had both of his sons before he went in, there was really no association. Like, they were his children, but he didn't feel like an emotional connection to them. And this narrative here is really striking, because Terrence says, so it was like being a dad. It was like being a dad was a false reality for me until it was at some point. I think my son was 6, my youngest son. He was 6, so my oldest was 8. And mind you, at this time, he's incarcerated. And he was sitting at the visiting table, and he just kept saying, "Daddy, Daddy." And I had no idea he was talking to me. This reality, and I'm not preaching, I'm not saying that I'm not arguing for heteronormative families. But according to my participants, especially my Black male participants, they came up in communities where they felt like they didn't have any role models. Their role models was the streets. And therefore, for those who had children, as Terrence said, it was a result of being sexually active. So it wasn't really an emotional connection or something worth nurturing to them. And this reality hit him when he was in prison. continuing, I also noticed fear and concern for their children. So for instance, Joaquin, when talking about his fears for his son, said, I just didn't want him to go through the foster care system. I don't want her messing up, talking about the kid's mother, his son's mother, and my kid be taken. That's what I was worried about. If my kid is going to be okay, you know what I'm saying? Or they're being mistreated. I was in the foster care system. I vowed to myself that if I had kids, they would never go through what I went through. And Joaquin just added information. Joaquin grew up in a foster care system where he was also abused, and he ran away, and he ended up going to juvenile prison, youth prison in Texas. Eventually that led to adult incarceration or several stints of incarceration. So Joaquin is still dealing with the trauma of his childhood and his multiple stints of being in prison. So Rick, again, going back to his daughter's experiences of being molested while he was in prison, he expressed concern because he talked about how she didn't feel comfortable around men. And he says, she don't like to be hugged by men. She's so broken behind what she can do. What happened to her in the past, that she was even uncomfortable with me giving her a hug after all these years of me being in prison. That really hurt me. That messed with me a lot. I reached out to hug her, and she was very uncomfortable with me hugging her. Rick in this moment was crying because he spent 16 years in federal prison, and he was home now, and his daughter, she couldn't associate or connect with this individual who was her father, all because of what she experienced growing up as a kid. And this was deeply concerning to Rick. And Rick also expressed how one of his biggest concerns, especially for his oldest one, because I asked about their concerns for their children, and he mentioned that, I want a relationship so bad with my kids, a loving and caring relationship. That's my biggest concern. It's not being able to have that relationship that I so badly want from all of my kids, but it was especially his oldest who was molested and still dealing with this trauma that he was deeply concerned about. And this goes against that narrative that Black fathers do not care about their children, don't want to be in their children's lives, or deadbeats. Most of the individuals that I talk to, they desperately try to overcome these legal barriers and structural barriers and want to be there for their kids. But, the challenges they face, sometimes were just overbearing. They were just too much. And my last theme is redemptive fathering. Many of the formerly incarcerated Black fathers that I've talked to thus far felt that now that they were out of prison, they had another chance at being a good father. Whether they were maybe now at this, maybe they had another child, for instance. Maybe they had a new son or daughter after being released from incarceration, and they felt like there was a second chance at fatherhood, or things that they observe in their own children. So for instance, Joaquin said, my biggest concern is to be better than me, to be better than his father and be successful, accomplish goals that I couldn't accomplish. And most important, break the family generational curse, which is incarceration. So although, for Joaquin, it wasn't necessarily anything that he did differently. He loved his kids or what have you, but his what he hoped for mostly was that they would break the generational curse. And he felt like if they could do that, that he did his job as a father. And then Terrence said, it's like I'm learning on the fly because I'm not really trying to be that typical traditional father figure, because I gave that up. I lost that right. So I need them to be fine, however our relationship is going to work moving forward. And Terrence, he felt like he didn't have the right to father anymore. He did the best he could, but his children were grown. They had their own children. And he felt like, he had to let his sons dictate and govern their father-son relationship. But for him, he was willing. He felt like this was, although he felt like he was no longer in control because the sons were grown, it was a new, it was a second chance at fatherhood. It was a second chance at getting it right, and just being a part of his children's lives. So in discussion, because the study is ongoing, so I'm hesitant to make any conclusions thus far. But fatherhood plays an integral role in incarceration and reentry experiences, especially for Black men. It's often a role that isn't explored or centered in social science research. Lived experiences of formerly incarcerated Black men deserve to be told in their own words. And that's why it's so important to do qualitative work to delve deep and gather a sense of how incarceration impacted formerly incarcerated individuals, especially Black men, how it impacted their identity, their fatherhood role, and so forth. But it's important for us to listen to them as researchers. Contrary to dominant narratives surrounding justice involved Black men and fathers, many strive to overcome structural and legal barriers that hinder their progress. I saw this in many of my interviews. These men, they try so hard to counter that narrative of deadbeat fathers or missing Black fathers. They wanted to be there. Yes, they had a criminal record. They felt like they had legal restraints that just kept their hands tied behind their backs. But in several ways, they tried to resist this narrative and employ their own meanings of fatherhood. So that completes my presentation. I know I took up some time, but thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So much to think about. I encourage the chat that they should write their questions down for you for afterwards. Dr. Ada, you will be next. She has a topic that is so focused on TCNJ, I think.
Sure do. Thank you to everyone joining us today. So my presentation is going to focus on some data that was collected here about the Black student experience and really trying to complicate what folks generally here at TCNJ, but just globally understand about Blackness. And so first we must define or think about who do we consider to be Black and who is part of the African diaspora. So that includes folks who identify as Black American, such as Michael B. Jordan, or Bay Jordan, as some people might say, Kerry Washington, who is Black American, but also is Jamaican. Her father is actually born and raised in Jamaica. Folks that are African, such as Lupita Nyong'o from Kenya and Diana Guerra from Zimbabwe. But folks that are also Caribbean, right, such as Naomi Harris, who is both Trinidadian and Jamaican, and individuals who identify as Afro-Latinx. So we have Rome Flynn, who is Afro-Cuban, and Elan Noel, who is Afro-Panamanian. Okay. So now that we have an understanding of who is Black or what constitutes parts of the African diaspora, we now need to think about what is Blackness, right? So Blackness encompasses one's connection to the Black group, how they act, be, do, perform, express, and most simply embody their Black identity. So it's how we dress, what we eat, right? Thinking about collard greens is like transnational in so many different ways. Mac and cheese fights, right, that folks have about who makes the best mac and cheese. It's also in how we talk and our overall expression. So here we have examples of not just our culture in terms of Black Twitter and Twitter's whole existence, and most social media's entire existence is on the back of Black people, that there's multiplicity in understanding, right? There's no one way to be Black or embody Blackness. So Beyonce's form of Blackness is different from Brittany Howard's form of Blackness, just like a Blurred who does cosplay has a different form of Blackness, but it doesn't mean that there's a right or a wrong. And Blackness is not just steeped within trauma and oppression. It's also about joy, resilience, perseverance, and the relentless fight for Black liberation. So that takes us to thinking about the particular study that I'm going to talk about, some preliminary findings, okay? So what was the whole purpose of it? Well, it was to explore the role of racial identity, Black racial identity specifically, ethnic group membership, colorism, racial discrimination, and this idea of racial solidarity or linked fate, and how that all of those things play a factor or play roles into Black students' educational and mental health outcomes. So it was really to understand the social implications of the increased ethnic diversity that we're seeing in who is Black at TCNJ, or even more broadly at predominantly white institutions. And to better understand how something such as racial solidarity could potentially be a promotive factor or some type of protective factor for Black students at predominantly white institutions. So who did we study? The survey went out to 404 Black identified TCNJ students in fall of 2019. As you see here, there were 251 participants who actually completed the survey. So that tells you we have a pretty representative, a pretty solid representation of the Black student experience. About 62% of individuals who identified as Black filled out the survey. As you see here, in terms of the breakdown, those who identified as Black American and those who identified as Black immigrants. So Black immigrants constituting Africans. So 44 participants identified as African, 90 identified as Caribbean, and 29 as Afro-Latinx. It's also important that when we talk about identity, there's always a focus on multiraciality, but we also need to look at multi-ethnicity. So there were about 36% of the participants, over a third, who identified as being of 2 or more Black ethnic identities, okay, or Black ethnic groups. The population was overwhelmingly female, which is not entirely surprising. We did have some folks who identified as non-binary, but in the sample size is too small to have explored them in some of the analyses that I'll be talking about. In terms of the breakdown by discipline, we collapsed some into broader themes, and by we, I'll talk about who the we is. So those in professional programs were those in business, education, and nursing, and then STEM would be STEM, science and engineering. About 41% of our students, right, identify as first generation. So they are the first in their families to attend a 4-year institution. And so that uniquely is shaping their experience here. 60%, that is a very large majority of our students work, of our Black students, okay? Working either part-time or full-time on and off campus. But I think what's most important is to pay attention to this last thing, that over 66%, it was like 66.2% or something, identified having a GPA of 3.0 or higher. So yes, that may not be entirely surprising given the academic rigor and pursuits of students at TCNJ, but when talking about this pejorative narrative of Black students not doing well at campuses or in college or in school more generally, that is not necessarily the case. So I'm going to highlight some findings from some preliminary analyses that were done with some of my students. So the first 2 were done with my seniors in my lab who did their senior capstone project for the psychology department. And the last that I will talk about is a study that was done with my student this past summer via Muse that we're also going to be presenting at our big national education conference, AERA, in April. So to set the stage in terms of understanding the first 2 studies I'm going to be talking about, which again focus on skin tone, gender, and aspects of racial discrimination. So the first of skin tone is a gradient of from very dark to light skinned, very light. So one of my students' studies focused just on those who identified as dark skinned, because most of the research that we have about colorism in the Black community has focused primarily on comparing the experiences of dark skinned individuals to light skinned individuals. And this student was very interested in exploring the unique experiences of dark skinned individuals, and more specifically diving deeper into potential gender variation, because again, most of the research on colorism has focused largely on women, okay? Racial discrimination, so the rates of frequency of racist experiences and how much it bothered them on a scale of 0 to 5. Then this idea of racial solidarity, which is drawn from Michael Dawson, who is an eminent Black political scientist at University of Chicago, who created the term linked fate, which is largely studied in political science, has not really been looked at as this idea of belonging or kinship that we might want to consider exploring in education and psychology. And so it really is the extent to which Black individuals perceive that what happened to them or happens to them is inextricably tied to their race rather than their individual choices, okay? So do they understand basically racialized oppressive systems, or do they think it's, I didn't work hard enough, XYZ thing, meritocracy? And then the last was using the Lovey-Bond's depression, anxiety, and stress scale to look at these 3 components for mental health. So in broad strokes, again, some initial analyses. So overall, students reported that they experienced discrimination at least once a week. Okay, we had some students who said that they didn't experience it, and some who said that they were experiencing it nearly every week, or several times, but most were saying that they experienced it at least once a week. For the study that focused specifically on dark-skinned individuals, we found that female-identified participants reported more depressive symptoms. So they had higher rates of depression. For both the study that focused on just dark-skinned individuals and the study that looked at the experiences of dark-skinned and light-skinned participants, we found that male-identified participants reported more stress and anxiety. Okay, so females presenting more depression and males expressing more anxiety and stress. So that leads us to then talking about this next finding in terms of the relationship between racial discrimination and anxiety. So such that we found that increases in frequency of racial discrimination tended to demonstrate a propensity or predict higher rates of anxiety. Okay, so those who were experiencing more racist encounters were also typically expressing higher rates of anxiety. And then this component of racial solidarity, so my sense of kinship with the Black community. Uniquely, what we found here was that those who reported lower levels of racial solidarity, so less kinship to the Black community at TCNJ, were more likely to experience depression, higher rates of depression. So those who were less inclined to feel some sense of connection with tended to report more depression. So in this case of racial solidarity, right? Well, we also had some open-ended questions to dive a little bit deeper, because a lot of the conversations around intra-Black dynamics more broadly are rather just focused on the tensions. So it was really important to ask the students why, or really what is their experience? So one of the first questions that was asked was, what does the Black community actually mean to you, right? So from defining it to telling us the meaningful components. Overall, most students were telling us that they had a sense of camaraderie, connection, understanding, safety, resistance, and joy. So for example here, saying it means home, being accepted by people who have a similar experience to me, feeling like it's a safe space. That between home and safe space, those were routinely seen across the responses. But there are also other examples or other experiences, because again, Blackness is not one thing, in which folks didn't feel as if though they identified or were considered to be part of the Black community. So this is from an Afro-Latinx participant, right? So I associate it with being Black American, although I share similar experience with people of the Black community, of darker complexions, specifically women with 4C hair, but I don't fit in with Black culture, right? So you have those who are feeling this sense of connection, but also those that are experiencing some sense of tension or exclusion. Followed up by asking about moments in which they experienced tension within the group, but also moments that they experienced camaraderie or a sense of connection with, right? So again, overwhelmingly, most participants are saying that they feel as if though there's a really great community across Black identified students on TCNJ campus. Many talked about having friend groups consisting of folks across the diaspora. And that many are using these friendships and relationships as also an opportunity to learn about different cultures and experiences, as well as trying to break away from the stigma our parents placed upon us as against us, right? So this idea that older generations, there's this really complicated, tense relationship between Black immigrants and Black Americans. That's a whole conversation in of itself, socially constructed, but it's nice to see that this next generation is really trying to complicate that understanding, critique those relationships. But again, that's not necessarily the case for everybody. There's some, about a quarter of participants identified that they didn't necessarily feel that there was camaraderie across the Black population here at TCNJ. A simple no, or at times yes, but at times no as well, or I have never experienced this. And I thought this was really interesting, this particular participant, noting that they have not seen solidarity, but they have seen them get along, and purposefully delineating a difference between getting along, being in the same space, maybe working with and for certain causes, but seeing that solidarity is different from that. So this takes us to the second set of findings, okay? That is focused on racial identity, racial solidarity, and academic performance. So again, some context to situate the findings. So the first is looking at this construct of racial identity, which is from the multidisciplinary inventory for Black identity created by Sellers and his team at University of Michigan. And identity is comprised of three components, actually four, but for our study, we only focused on three. Centrality. So how central is it? Is like identifying as Black to who I am at my core. Public regard. How do I think other people, or how do other people feel about the Black group? Okay. And private regard is, what do I feel or perceive of the Black group? Again, using the same racial solidarity linked fate, and trying to see what is going on with these particular constructs as this relates to academic achievement. So broad strokes, across the board. Ooh, sorry, forgot to note. So for this particular thing, we looked at ethnic variation, so ethnic group variation between Black Americans and Black immigrants, and gender, as well as the intersection between ethnic group membership and gender, all right? So across the board, folks felt, most Black identified students felt that identifying as Black was very, very central to who they were, okay? They had an overwhelmingly positive perspective, so their private regard perspective of the Black community, but they were genuinely ambivalent. They didn't think people thought good or bad about the Black group. They had a strong sense of connection with others around TCNJ, on the TCNJ campus, and as noted earlier, doing well academically. So breaking down some of these findings a bit. So for centrality, we also did some preliminary analyses looking by discipline, because it was really important to have a conversation about in what ways may different disciplines be curating a different experience potentially for Black students. So male identified students in STEM reported the highest levels of centrality. So identifying as Black was most important to them, followed by those in arts and humanities, and males in professional programs reported the lowest levels of centrality. Females in STEM reported the lowest, okay, followed by those in professional programs, and those in arts, humanities, and social science were reporting the highest levels of centrality. When it comes to private regard, remember, across the board, they had a very positive point of view, right? They're thinking about the Black group in really positive ways, but Black Americans were reporting more positive relationship with the Black community relative to their Black immigrant peers. When it comes to perceptions of how others are viewing the group, males tended to have a slightly more positive perspective than female identified participants. So they thought other people's perceptions of the Black group more broadly were not that bad. When we then take a dive by a more intersectional dive, we see that Black immigrant males actually were reporting the highest in terms of public regard. So they believe that folks had a really positive perception of the Black group. Black American males and females were pretty ambivalent in terms of perceptions, but Black immigrant females thought folks had a very negative point of view, that others had a very not so great point of view about the Black group. When looking by discipline, we also see that men in STEM, male identified participants in STEM, had the highest levels of private regard, okay? So they thought above everybody else that that people had a really genuine positive perspective or experience with Black folk. When it comes to grades, which I'm always hesitant to look at this, hesitant to talk about this, because as the description said, I don't want to do a pejorative kind of who is doing better than who, right? As opposed to thinking about why is it or what resources are necessary for one group to have everybody actually succeed. So Everyone's doing well academically, but Black immigrants are doing slightly better than Black Americans, okay? And when disaggregating that even further, we actually see an ethnic group and gender variation, such that Black immigrant males are actually reporting the highest GPAs. There's not much variation. Actually, there's no variation with Black American and Black immigrant females, and Black American males are actually reporting the lowest GPAs. So what does this tell us? Well, clearly there's variety in Blackness at TCNJ, but that we need to continue to do more research on racial solidarity and in what ways that it might be a helpful, how are we creating spaces for Black students on our campus, and how are they building relationships, and in what ways is that potentially protecting their experience at predominantly white institutions. We also need to think about the ways in which Black immigrants' experiences in higher ed, they tend to have different higher grades. So is this an enactment of the model minority myth that is occurring in these spaces that is allowing them to succeed in ways that their Black American peers are not? When we think about practice, we need to be better about the ways in which we categorize our participants. And not just, again, I'm using data from admissions. So thinking about the ways in which we need to allow students to actually check all the boxes. I wasn't able to actually get those who identified as multiracial, because if you mark a multiracial, you're multiracial, you don't get to actually mark what races you are. When we think about culturally relevant pedagogy and curriculum, it needs to expand the entire African diaspora. So when thinking about who, for example, if we're in a science class and we're providing examples of Black scientists, we should also draw and bring forth African, Caribbean, and Afro-Latinx scientists' contributions to the forefront. And on the front of mental health, that we need more Black therapists and counselors. And with that, it aids us in being more culturally responsive, but it also means that folks need to provide more culturally relevant mental health resources, because the things that are utilized for white individuals are not the same thing that is going to be useful for our Black student population. So, although our Black students are doing generally fine, they can be doing better. And when we prioritize Black students' needs and success, everyone will also benefit. So I'd be remiss without thanking, of course, the members of my lab, many of which are here, Dominique Walker, in which I did muse with this past summer, and of course, the students, thank you for being part of this study.
Thank you. Yay. All right, Alma.
Yes, so I'm going to share a screen as well.
Yes.
Let's see how this goes. Excellent. I think you can see it.
Yes.
And let me remove this out of the way. How do I remove this out of the way? Okay, excellent. All right. Thank you all for being here today. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous Lenape peoples whose lands TCNJ stands on today and where I am presenting from in Philadelphia. Thank you also to the African American Studies Department for giving me the opportunity to present my work as part of Black History Month. It is a privilege to be on the same panel as Drs. Onyouwainwe and Mitchell. In today's presentation, I focus on graffiti in Kairos, on taking us actually to the continent in Egypt to illustrate the ways graffiti matters. In particular, I focus on one international feminist initiative done in 2015 to demonstrate the ways graffiti can illuminate tensions at the intersections of gender, class, religion, and nationality. By close reading this project and the graffiti produced in it, I show that it is much more complicated than a women's empowerment project. Rather, it plays into an ongoing project of policing public space and to the benefit of middle-class neoliberal individualistic agendas. But before I talk about this particular corner, I want to tell you why I appreciate graffiti in general. Graffiti is often talked about as a form of vandalism, a destruction of private and public property. I appreciate this vandalism because it challenges the normalization of the concept of property. What is property? Why do we need it? So much of the visual culture we experience in public, such as billboards, shop signs, and so on, are forms of advertisements paid for by private entities. Their money grants them access to public space. This is seen as acceptable. Instead, graffiti, I am suggesting, gives the poor and other minoritized people access to public space without the need of poor capital. Graffiti also offers us a moment to think differently about hegemonic ideas. So for example, this Instagram post by the son of Baldwin shows a photograph of freehand graffiti that demands we reconsider looting narratives and view them within narratives of enslavement, incarceration, police brutality, amongst other state-sanctioned white supremacist anti-Black racism. I saw this graffiti by my house on October 15, 2020. At the time, signs, posters, stickers encouraging people to vote, vote early, make their vote count were everywhere. The statement was, vote Trump out and everything will be better. Well, this graffiti presents a different perspective. It makes the argument that we will not be saved by a presidential vote and that a lesser evil is still evil. Therefore, it encourages and urges us to think of alternatives to change our realities. This graffiti was covered up a few days later but by some cutesy colorful bubbles. Graffiti is also a form of defacement. Defacement is when something that is considered valuable is deliberately damaged. Tausing, a scholar I quote, describes defacement as a form of desecration that, quote, unmasks to finally reveal truth, and it disrupts notions of wholeness and holiness in order to enlighten and bring insides out, unearthing knowledge and revealing mystery. End of quote. And therefore it can form, quote, an opening out, and thus becomes an exercise in life itself, at one with life and within life as lived in social affairs. So it's an interaction and an action and a reaction with the great chain of storytelling, end of quote. An example of defacement is on the monument of Confederate General Robert Lee in Virginia in June 2020. After outrage over the murder of George Floyd, the defacement of this monument suggests that Lee and whatever he stands for, as valuable as it may be for certain groups, is not valuable to others. And its defacement unearthed this knowledge and brought out and opened up a different life. But I'm going to go back to my corner in Cairo now. On the 25th of January, 2011, Egyptians took to the street demanding life, freedom, and social justice. عيش, حرية, عدالة اجتماعية. After demonstrations that lasted 18 days, the people brought down President Hosni Mubarak's 30-year reign. In June 2012, Mohammed Morsi, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, was elected president. And in June 2013, the military took over in a coup/counter-revolution, and the Minister of Defense, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, became president. I focus on this corner right here. I hope you can see my red pointer. This is the corner I look at, because it connects Midan al-Tahrir, which is where thousands of Egyptians gathered in since January 2011, with the Ministry of Interior, which controls the security services, with this big building here, which is one of the presidential residences, Midan Abdin. This area witnessed some of the most brutal clashes between demonstrators and state security forces. I analyzed one project on this corner to demonstrate the relationship between graffiti and access to streets. I show that analyzing graffiti and its production process can tell us a lot about the production and reproductions of systems of power and advantage that further the military authoritarian state's project of forgetting the needs and lives of the working classes to the advantage of middle class safety, aesthetics, and their lives. It is also part of the forgetting that the state's active agenda to co-opt the revolution and erase its traces. During the first week of April 2015, Women on Walls, WOW, staged an art intervention, WOW Unchained, as part of the Contemporary Arts Festival. WOW is a local initiative founded by Swedish journalist and photographer Mia Gröndal, who hired Egyptian artist Angie Balata as program manager in 2013. The initiative uses graffiti, quote, to talk about women and women's issues and rights with the aim to contribute to the empowerment of the Arab woman and form a more visible female presence in the streets of Egypt and the Middle East, end of quote. This art happening was funded by the Swedish Institute and the Embassy of Denmark in Cairo. The focus of WOW Unchained was, quote, expressing the female hero succeeding in being unchained from all the anger and the fear that is controlling us. In our daily life, we face various restrictions that in the long run create chains around us. Sometimes these chains are compelled by outside forces, and sometimes they are a creation of our own selves, end of quote. To establish this, 25 artists from Egypt, across the Arab world, and Sweden were invited to paint the walls. A day before the project started, rumors circulated on social media that the WOW project was going to whitewash revolutionary graffiti that's been happening in order to make space for their own new works. Grandal, the person who started this project, assured the press that no previous graffiti would be painted over, stating, quote, "We are not painting over graffiti from the revolution, despite rumors about town. Most of the art is already ruined from the past few years by police or whoever," end of quote. Despite Grandal's assurances, some of the graffiti was painted over, but in order to not erase the revolutionary graffiti, WOW Unchained opted then to paint above these works using cranes. So everything that you see above is part of WOW Unchained. Shortly after the start of WOW's project, a freehand graffiti by an unknown writer was sprayed below some of the new works. "This street is an acropolis. Only here, no commercial graffiti allowed." To this, Grandal responded, quote, "People think that the street's art is somehow holy because of the history and the people who have died here, and they call the street an acropolis. So does it mean that we should respect the dead by not touching these walls? No. My understanding is the respect of the dead is to make sure that we can get a good life for the future. And what these women are doing is showing that they have something to give, that they have not given up," end of quote. In these statements, Grandal includes herself as part of those who should be unchained and should benefit from the countless martyrs of the revolution by getting a better life But Grandal does not seem to acknowledge is her positionality as a white European middle-class older woman whose stakes are entirely different from those of Egyptian women, middle-class or otherwise, and men. Grandal faces very few of the social, political policing that are experienced by Egyptians. Grandal reasoned that the attacks directed at her project were a result of local artists, quote, "not liking women, and some street artists are trying to have control. It is a war of territory. They are trying to own it," end of quote. Grandal is not wrong in articulating revolutionary artists' anger as stemming from a desire to control territory. These artists fought for these streets since January 2011, risking their lives and losing their friends. Yet Grandal and participating artists do not acknowledge this. For instance, artist Dina Sadi, a Syrian-Russian, argued that the tension is, quote, "not about the wall. It is about people's egos. And we are actually painting over ruined walls, leaving everything else intact. But just because a group of ladies decide to do something on the wall, then suddenly everyone is not happy about it. Well, I guess that is exactly why we are here," end of quote. What Sadi labels as ruined walls is in fact sites of meaningful production for graffiti writers who, again, since January 2011, have been engaged in revolution in part in order to access public space, and by June 2013 had almost completely lost access to it. The privileged work of WOW is evident not only because of their access to city walls, but also the use of cranes, which require collaboration with state authorities for official permits. Furthermore, WOW Unchained had European funding, a European organizer, and included non-Egyptian artists. As a result, state authorities consider the project and its participants not as threatening, because they are removed from the affective relationship that local artists may have to this particular location and the revolution. In turn, by approving the project and granting permits, the military state could claim its support of freedom of expression and women's empowerment as values of the liberal nation state. WOW's access to the walls is embedded in middle-class, international liberal women's empowerment agenda, which is articulated through a generalized and globalized middle-class sisterhood that promotes individuals living their dreams and unlocking their passions. This is reflected in the visual imagery of the works that mostly focus on women's bodies, often with their wombs highlighted as places of growth and rebirth. And as this project fulfills its agenda, WOW Unchained denies access to local artists at the intersections of gender, class, and nationality. And as way of concluding, I would like to contemplate another moment of major change around this corner that happened in November 2017, which I am calling Neo Nefertiti. This Facebook post shows the walls being completely whitewashed. Shortly after, tweets started appearing of the mural with calligraphy and a rendition of Queen Nefertiti were being posted. These new works are a collaboration between two private sector institutions, the Greek campus, which rents this building, and Sipes, the commercial paint company that donated the paint. The erasure of the layers of graffiti not only wiped off critical signage of the revolution, it also co-opted it and sterilized the street. For example, the use of Nefertiti, who became a symbol of resistance during the revolution and grounded many Egyptians in a claimed common pharaonic past. Perhaps the most famous is a Zift, that's their name, their pseudonym, interpretation of Nefertiti on the walls of the French school just across the street from the corner. Online, Zift shared his work with the caption, quote, "A tribute to all women of our beloved revolution. Without you, we wouldn't have gotten this far. Thank you," end of quote. In Zift's wheat paste paperwork, Nefertiti is depicted as wearing a gas mask. She is returning an unwavering gaze. She signals a steadfast participant in the revolution. In contrast, the December 2017 Nefertiti is a modernized and sexualized caricature. She is described in a tweet as, quote, "a fair and lovely user with lips for sex and taste for expensive sunglasses. She is their political statement now," end of tweet. Nefertiti is transformed into a depoliticized, cleansed individual and emptied of any meaningful self-expression hipster, another tweet states. Both these projects, WOW Unchained and Neo Nefertiti, are acts of erasure as beautification that in effect promote passive, middle-class orientalist, individualist, neoliberal consumer aesthetics, instead of a multi-vocal palimpsest of active debate and political engagement. Thank you, everyone.
I guess I'm on mute. Thank you. Oh my gosh, this was a wonderful, wonderful event. I mean, I'm so impressed with all of you. Oh, there goes my timer, sorry. So we're gonna do questions and I'm gonna try to manage. So make sure if you raise a digital hand, I think you'll pop up at the beginning of my pictures, maybe. But I have two questions already. So for Professor Mitchell, hello, Professor Mitchell, during your research, have you come across any programs, whether they be rehabilitation programs in prison or programs after incarceration, that help parents deal with these very issues you mentioned? If some form of these programs do exist, have you seen any positive results on the parents? If no, do you have any thoughts on possible solutions to assist these parents?
That's a great question. So I am aware of, so you do have some like in prison programs. Or so for instance, you have a program called, what is it? It's called, I think it's called Incarcerated. Is it called Incarcerated Fatherhood? It's some, it's some like national programming that that prisons can institute. So you have that. I mean, you do have some form of prison programs that vary across the country. As far as programs that serve formerly incarcerated individuals with children, formerly incarcerated parents, I have come across some of those programs, and from my research, because I'm a qualitative researcher, so although statistics may say that okay, this program is beneficial for individuals with children, it helps them renegotiate their strained relationships with their families. I'm most interested in the story, what my participants have to say, what the individuals who live this have to say. And because oftentimes when you look at qualitative work, sometimes, you'll find that the numbers don't speak for real experiences. And not saying the numbers aren't important. So in my ongoing research, many of my participants have mentioned that for the programs that they do get involved with after incarceration, so many programs they're involved in are nonprofits. And I'm talking about programs in Dallas and Houston, which is where I've been recruiting. And while there are classes, so for instance, parenting classes that teach, for instance, men how to be better fathers, a critique is that these programs aren't culturally responsive, so they don't necessarily recognize the lived experiences of historically oppressed individuals and economically distressed communities. So there's this attempt to have this one-size-fits-all approach to reentry, and it just doesn't work. And I'm not even talking about for formerly incarcerated individuals of color, because just say if you're white and you return into a rural community, then you have different experiences and needs than somebody returning to the inner city. So a critique is that for those programs that do exist, they're not culturally responsive and they just don't serve the needs of those who come from communities that have been disproportionately affected by mass incarceration. But do programs exist? They do.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm going to go with two other chat questions because there's one for each of our speakers. And then the hand electronic hand raise category, and you'll be next after that, okay? So for Dr. Ada, I don't know if I'm phrasing this correctly, but how would you guess these numbers change or stay the same between Black students who are part of cultural social groups on campus and those who are not? Do you think there are significant differences?
So we haven't analyzed that data yet. It is something that I want to look at because that actually, for the stats nerds, I'm trying to think of racial solidarity and linked fate as actually a latent construct that's constituting this, how they're perceiving their understanding of racial oppression to the Black community, but also their connection with particular organizations. So we did ask those questions. Previous research has demonstrated that for students broadly that are involved in campus things, athletics, clubs, government, they tend to have a stronger sense of community with the campus, which also results in like a different type of engagement in the classroom, and it has a lot of positive impacts. So yes, I do foresee that there might potentially be some variation, but there's still some I would want to explore more to understand why are those folks not engaged, right? It's not just to say comparing those who are and those who aren't. So what are the barriers, whether socially or financially, that restrict some students from engaging in some of these organizations?
Yeah, because I think you did have one of your comments said that they think, they get along, but there's like a BSU, there's an NAACP, there's an African group, there's a Caribbean. So in those kind of arrangements, it doesn't really lead to the connection necessarily. Okay, Catherine Kahn has a question for Alma. Being in Philadelphia, I'm curious on her position on the Philly Mural Arts Program. Are there ways to institutionalize and/or normalize street art without co-opting its roots and appropriating it? Thanks, Catherine.
I am only laughing so big because I think, of course, about this all the time. I think the murals are beautiful. I have yet to study the mural project, but and this is sort of an ironic answer, or a contradictory answer, in that I am interested in the de-institutionalized, the things that are not institutionalized, the things that do not come through a process of policing. Because once something is institutionalized, somebody's doing something to say yes or no to something, right? It goes through some forms of edits, whether it's a curatorial edit or whatever, but it goes through this kind of process. Now, of course, I say this is kind of contradictory, because studying graffiti in an academic institution is institutionalizing the study of graffiti in institutions. So I am, the contradiction is not, I'm aware of it. The answer is, the question about co-opting is very interesting, because part of why I've studied and very interested in studying the graffiti is because it is ephemeral. Most of the graffiti, and part of the reason that I sort of say it's okay to study it, is because I also think it's a historical document, right? There's some narrative that I am hoping becomes useful to those of us engaged in revolution, right? That we can get to learn from that. Now, is there a tension that this process of documentation is co-optation? Yes. Now, the question is, what do we do with that is a different one, right? I think that is a tension that by default of documenting something that is meant to be ephemeral is a very thin line. And I think the only way to engage with that or respond to it is to try to think about the ethics of who gets to document it, how do they speak about it, who's engaged in the documentation, and so on. I hope this answers your question. Yeah, I hope that answers. If not, follow up. I like follow up.
What's so great about this event is you guys all are TCNJ faculty. So instead of like a speaker who you could never find again, these people have offices when we get back on campus. They have emails, so you can find them and follow up. So thank you so much for waiting with your hand raised. Yes, hi, unmute. Tell us who you are.
My name is Carson. Hi, doctor. I've been practicing some.
I appreciate it. Yes, well done.
Again, I want to first thank you guys all here for having this event and for discussing your research. I feel this has been very educational and impactful to me personally. My question was directed to Dr. and forgive me for mispronouncing your name, Dr. Ada.
Yeah, Dr. Onyouwainwe. Yeah.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Onyouwainwe. I
Yeah.
think in regards to the goal of Black solidarity, how exactly do you feel like this goal can be achieved when at times it feels like individuality can be like a setback to solidarity? Because I feel at times when you think, like you just went over your presentation, how there is a spectrum of Blackness here at TCNJ. My Black story is not your Black story, is not anyone's Black story. So based on this individual approach, how can you find solidarity when individualism is something that is also taught to be fostered and supported, but at the same time, it's like the goal, it's like the idea like a sacrificial, you have to sacrifice some individuality to achieve solidarity, or is solidarity able to coexist with individuality?
It's the latter, that these things can coexist. One of the things in terms of conversations I've had with Dr. Haswani is thinking more towards coalition building, right? So we think about coalition across racial lines, but we need to think about solidarity as a form of coalition across the diaspora, right? So for example, thinking about BLM, right? Created by 3 Black women who are children of immigrants, yet forefronting the experiences of Black men, which has then also led to others forefronting experiences for Black women. Yet we are still not necessarily having intersectional conversations when it comes to Black trans lives, Black immigrant deportation, all of these things, right? So it's also not, for example, one organization or one entity, one movement to solve all the things. So this is where coalition building is really useful and helpful. So yes, individual wants and goals can come together with others to work towards collective goals.
I would like to add to that, and Kaj, thank you for coming. I think part of what's very important about understanding and I think this question is very important because we are in a very individualistic society that says if it's not happening to me, then it might not matter. But coalition building is actually understanding that if it happens to you, it might happen to me. And therefore, I will stand by you and behind you in the sense of, and not only, it's not an altruistic thing, right? And people might want to think of it as altruism, but it's not that. It's actually understanding that the violence that happens against Black people in the United States, the police violence, is something that happens in many different places. For example, Egypt, right? The violence against the protesters in Egypt, who are on the continent of Africa, right? If we want to think of, and it's, right, it's not a racial aspect, but it is the idea of police violence. So it doesn't help anyone to sort of think this police violence is different than that police violence. They're very similar because they're both state sanctioned, right? So that becomes a way for us to think of coalition building that is not just based on the individual. And I thank you for letting me interject.
So much for those answers. I really appreciate it.
All right. No more hand raised. So there's another question in the chat. Question for Ada from Chris Smith, Program Assistant for Criminology and African American Studies. Is there any indication of how prepared students felt for college before coming to TCNJ?
So we didn't ask that question, but we did ask for students who were involved in EOF, Bonner, or Cooperman, because those are college prep programs as well as retention programs. So that's the first part of my response. The second part is, it doesn't matter, we're still at a PWI. There's no way to ever prepare anyone who is Black-bodied at a white institution for what they're going to experience, even those who grew up in whiteness, because they're coming through another reflective process during emerging adulthood for many of these individuals. And for some, there might be an awakening that they're experiencing in which their Blackness is becoming more pronounced, right? For others, it's being able to see people that look like them that they may have not had the opportunity before, which then is impacting or connecting previous experiences that they had, right? So for example, myself, I wasn't aware of, I had some inklings of the different ways that I was being sorted and stratified in school, right? So most AP honors kids were children of African immigrants. It wasn't until I was in physics my senior year that we happened to have one of our friends who was also on the football team, the first Black American to be in any of our honors and AP courses, right? But wasn't able to put that together until I then got to college and was talking to other people about similar experiences. So preparation, yes or no, but we also have to question the fact that at some point the institution itself needs to actually change. Therefore, we wouldn't need things like EOF or Bonner, and that we sometimes don't ask about preparation for certain populations, and we need to critique why is it that we're saying under those coming from particular demographic backgrounds, are they prepared or not, as opposed to has the institution actually changed itself for those populations?
So I have a question maybe for all of you. So if I think like a thread that runs through, Michael says qualitative research is so important. So much of criminology does not focus on qualitative research. What qualitative research means, we saw in his presentation, we need these people's words. If we're going to get at any kind of corrective, we need their stories. Dr. Ada's scholarship is all about research, is qualitative. So her data points are these surveys and these peoples and these stories. And then Alma, even yours, thinking about the ephemeral nature of graffiti, but what can you capture for them is the stories. So, I think we think a lot about, so many things seem they want to solve with quantitative numbers. They want to say like, if we have this many number of people, so what is the power of the qualitative in the storytelling do you think in your research? And I don't want to know who goes first, so. Unmute, Michael.
Yeah, just so in the work, and I'm sure this is applicable to my colleagues here, but especially in the work that I do, how can we effectuate change? How can we truly effectuate change? How can we truly say that we want to institute reform or even move towards abolition? How can we really help individuals that are involved in the legal system if we don't know the root causes, or we'd even led them to the criminal legal system? And I think qualitative work, gathering those stories, those narratives, it gets at the root cause, because for too long, and criminology has been complicit in much of the state violence we see, play out with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. Criminology as a discipline has been complicit in that. Criminology has influenced policies, has influenced the war on drugs and stop and frisk and juvenile waivers to the adult system due to its reluctance to get at the root causes, its reluctance to see the importance of lived experiences and stories. So I think that like I said, to truly, institute change, you have to get at the root causes, and qualitative work allows you critical qualitative work. Not saying anybody who goes out and interviews someone, although yes, that might be considered qualitative work, but having a truly critical, intersectional analysis of the structural issues, systemic issues that lead to many of the issues that we've talked about today. I think qualitative work is most appropriate at getting at that, but it takes it takes that lens, and it also takes collaboration. So I'm sure there's some connection between the work that I do, and not even just looking at parental incarceration, but I'm sure there's a connection between the work that I do and the work that Ada does, and the work that Alma does. So we have to, and our disciplines have to come out of their silos. Criminology is very guilty of that, and I think that's a disservice to the discipline. Looking at the experiences of those that are involved in the legal system. But we have to get out of our silos, collaborate, and get at the root causes and amplify those personal stories, those lived experiences. Sorry for talking too much.
Not too much at all. As many of my students who have been in my classes, I will always say, there's no such thing as objectivity. Numbers are not objective. Quantitative researchers, you are the actual tool that's interpreting those numbers. Those numbers are just numbers, but the way I'm interpreting those numbers is going to be very different from a white man who's doing the same work, right? So first of all, we need to stop hiding behind our interpretation of numbers and acknowledge the issues with that. Two, the numbers don't mean anything without context, and you don't get context without actual voices. And when we're thinking about some of the populations that we study, they're vulnerable populations, which means most of our fields have largely ignored them. And if you really want to change the paradigm, we have to do relationship building, and relationship building needs qualitative work. So we have to do the qualitative work in some realms in order to get to the quantitative work. We know quantitative carries a particular way or particular weight because of policy implications, right? We know politicians only look at numbers. They're not necessarily always looking at stories, but there's hope, right? That some folks are realizing that numbers don't tell the whole story.
I will just add quickly two things. One, when it comes to incarceration in California, for them to decide how many new cell jails to build, they look at second year students, like elementary, second grade students. They're 6 and 7 years old. They do some mathematical equation based on race and home economics and so on. And then based on that, they decide how many new cells to build 20 years later. This is what quantitative research does, right? It already criminalizes before we even exist, right? Before anyone actually ever exists. So I second all of that. But the other, as a person who's advocating feminism, narratives, because they are marginalized, is why we need to center them. right? There's a something, right? This is why Indigenous peoples' histories are not told, because their languages are not written. Their languages are oral. And until they write their languages, they will not exist, but they exist. They've always existed. And the fact that they are narrative, oral narrative, it has allowed us and allowed institutionalization and white supremacy and capital and so on to erase them. So I'm a scientist by training as an engineer, and I still couldn't understand what those numbers meant if I didn't actually see a place, talk to people. So this is why I think narrative, it's stories. It is stories. This is all we have. And if people tell us otherwise, then they also seem to just look at a mathematical equation and know what it is, forgetting that the page has a lot of other words. That is narrative.
So we're almost at time, but we have one more question. Kajatan?
Thank you, words. Thank you again for your patience and for being here to answer my questions and all of our questions. My follow-up question is about the term coalition. I really appreciate that term, and I'm privileged to be on the e-board actually of one of the organizations you talk about, the Association of Students for Africa. And when we plan our events, of course, Africa and Africanism is a central point, but I feel like our e-board has really tried to work beyond that to see the Pan-Africa, the diaspora, and to see just Blackness and the Black community in general. So we try to plan our events to build that. However, I feel like there are also innate and learned barriers that keep us from truly accomplishing that. Personally, I know being brought up, coming here from Nigeria, my parents teaching me how to act in public, how to speak, how to address. It really does differ from how a lot of my friends who are African American were brought up here. So as a member of an e-board, as a student, as an African American person, and as an individual who cares, what advice would you give me and my e-board members and us in general to truly break down these barriers and reconstruct that coalition to create a society that is more inclusive and understanding of other people, and to truly reach out to all our Black brothers and sisters?
Good question. So first, also, as a child of Nigerian immigrants, anti-Blackness is global. A lot of what Black immigrant parents are seeing before they come to the States is fed through media and media's perception, a stereotypical perception of Black-bodied folks, but they also witness the harm that is done to Black-bodied folks in the States. So a lot of what they're doing is out of a way to protect, but not necessarily understanding that that's also a way to alienate, right? So first and foremost, I think there's something to be said about there needs to be space for Black people to have Black people conversations without the white gaze, and that's very difficult. That's the reason why things like this still exist, right? Because if, for example, if a bunch of Black people across the diaspora were having conversations, Coming to America too would have never been made. Right? Yeah, because that's about to undo all the work that Black Panther just did. But neither here nor there. So in ways to think about coalition building across the Black groups, which yes, they're doing an amazing job at that. I have many of the students are in my lab and in my classes. Think about, okay, we have our individual groups, but do you guys have a monthly coalition meeting of all the Black e-board members from all the organizations coming together and talking collectively about what Black needs are needed across and how folks can work together to help meet those needs? Because we can't do things like we don't know what we don't know. And yes, it seems like a cop-out, especially, it seems like a cop-out to say that we need to talk first, but we actually do need to talk first, right? At least amongst ourselves, we need to talk first before we can actually do. Because sometimes folks try to do before talking and it ends up doing more harm than good. So that would be my suggestion, is getting y'all together, getting the various e-boards, NAACP, BSU, the Haitian, AFSA, but we also need to make sure that we're making spaces for our Afro-Latinx populations, both Black folk and Latinx folks, because there's lots of conversations, there's ways in which nobody wants to claim them and doesn't allow them to have a space anywhere. That you can be both Black and Latinx. Those things exist. The slave trade did things, right? Most Black-bodied folks were in Latin America and parts of the Caribbean. So we need to make sure that we're creating space for everybody who's actually part of the diaspora as well.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. And I will take your advice.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. At one point, we had an overwhelming number of 170 people in the audience, which I want to just, everyone should clap for that. And we have right now 93 still hanging strong. So thank you all so much. Thank you to my presenters. I enjoyed all of your presentations. You guys are doing amazing work. You contribute so much, I think, to this campus, this primarily white institute. We need these stories. We need them. So thank you so much. Thank you all for attending. Come back next year because I'm planning on having an annual one of these. So look forward to it. Everyone have a great night.